Okay, welcome everyone to the second Oregon Mariculture Network meeting. We are really excited to have all of you here today. For those who I have not met before, my name is Alex. I am the Coastal Mariculture Extension Specialist with Oregon Sea Grant, and today I'm going to be co-facilitating with Suzie. Suzie, if you want to unmute and do a little intro.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Suzie O'Neill, and I'm the Coastal Communities and Fisheries Coordinator at Ecotrust.
So for those of you who maybe are attending for the first time, the goal of the Oregon Mariculture Network is to provide connections across the mariculture sector and a platform for being able to do knowledge sharing, training, and overall support the mariculture sector. And we are doing that by working together and collaborating on network-defined priorities. So during our last meeting, we collectively defined network priorities and actions that we wanted to work on together, which included learning about mariculture policies and regulations, understanding what activities around mariculture are currently happening on the coast, as well as increasing some technical expertise and knowledge. And we're working together towards the network priorities, and today are going to be focused really in on those working towards policy solutions. So I first want to start by acknowledging that there is a lot of expertise in the Zoom room here today. So I know there's a lot of agency staff who are really deeply knowledgeable on and actually implement mariculture policies and regulations in Oregon, as well as industry members, researchers, restoration practitioners, food processors who have all navigated these permitting pathways, scientific and restoration permits and permissions, and a complex jurisdictional landscape. We are specifically not advocating for or against any particular policies, but really just trying to create a place for co-learning and discussion around mariculture policies in Oregon. And so we've kind of drafted some guiding principles for our meeting today of both honoring the agenda and learning goals, being respectful of the different opinions, perspectives, and expertise in the room, practicing curiosity and actively engaging, assuming good intent, and being mindful of speaking time. We're starting with this kind of general overall welcome, and then we're going to dive right into an overview of Oregon's policies around mariculture permitting in Oregon that Suzie and I are going to do at a really high level. And then we have a presentation from Stephanie Otts and Catherine Janasie from the National Sea Grant Law Center on some legal research that they've been conducting. Then we're going to ask you all to please stay for some breakout discussions around permitting policies and resources related to mariculture policies in Oregon, and then we'll do our typical wrap up and general updates. So starting with this high-level overview of mariculture in Oregon, Oregon has three primary mariculture species. Oysters have the longest cultivation history, starting in the early 1900s for in-water cultivation. We also grow dulse, a red seaweed, which started in 2018 and is a land-based tank aquaculture, as well as purple sea urchin ranching, which started in 2023, which is also a land-based tank culture method. So we're going to give a high-level overview of permitting policies around these species, starting with oysters. As I said, they have a really long history of cultivation in Oregon and therefore have a very well-established permitting pathway. NOAA Fisheries recently released this really excellent guide to shellfish aquaculture permitting earlier this year. And it's a really excellent resource. And I believe Terry King is here or planning to attend today. And I'm sure would be happy to answer any additional questions you might have about the guide. But at a glance, there are 10 entities that are involved in approving a shellfish permit in Oregon for commercial aquaculture. Typically requires over 2 years to get through this whole process. And these leases are granted in perpetuity. So the longest operating commercial shellfish farm that I am aware of started operating in 1907. But these leases stipulate really particular uses. So there's not really a mechanism to modify them. For example, switching gear types from like a bottom culture to a container, or bag, or floating culture. So we're going to walk through, again, at a really high level, starting with what you would do in order to scope a site. In Oregon, the majority of our state-owned tidelands are owned by the state of Oregon, and you can apply to the Oregon Department of Agriculture for a shellfish plat lease. Since 1997, this specifically has only allowed for oyster cultivation, so no other species of shellfish. And when you're scoping a site of where you might want to set up a commercial aquaculture farm in water, you also need to consider local estuary zoning, which is under Oregon statewide Goal 16, which defines 3 different management units, which are shown here for Tillamook Bay and Netarts Bay. So we have natural conservation and development management units. Aquaculture is allowed in all three management units, but there has been some uncertainty around what gears are allowed in which management unit type. Additionally, the site has to fall into a certified shellfish growing area. So, under the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, Oregon Department of Agriculture conducts regular water quality monitoring in the 7 locations that are shown here on the map. ODA then classifies these areas as approved, conditionally approved, or prohibited for growing shellfish for human consumption. So this is that same example in Tillamook and Netarts Bay, showing the certified areas in this light green, the conditionally approved areas in the dark green, and the prohibited areas in red. But that site also needs to not be occupied by an existing farm. So these are shown in blue as an overlay of these certified growing areas. On top of that, it has to have suitable environmental conditions to actually set up an oyster farm.
All right, I'm going to jump in here and walk us through the flow chart after scoping your site. So next, you'll apply for a shellfish plat lease with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. Again, this is a lease for the state-owned tidelands where you'll be farming your shellfish. Next, you're going to begin the process of applying for a federal permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. For context, the Army Corps issues shellfish aquaculture permits for structures in or over navigable waters, such as cages, racks, trays, lines, and pilings, as well as for dredge and fill activities, such as spreading gravel or mechanical harvesting. So the first step in obtaining your federal permit is to choose which application form you want to use. There are multiple options as listed on the slide, and the joint permit application is the most widely applicable option, meaning that you can use it not only for your federal permit application, but also to apply for other permits and approvals throughout the process, including for the agencies listed below it on the slide here. The next step is local government review. So you'll want to meet early on in the process with your city or county planning department to ensure that your proposed farm adheres to local rules and regulations, including the estuary management plan in your area, as Alex mentioned. You'll also need your local planning department to sign off on your federal permit application. Depending on the scope and proposed activities of your farm, you may need a removal fill permit from the Oregon Department of State Lands. So you want to consult with them to see if you need that permit. And then now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the federal permits and approvals. So in that earlier slide, we discussed the application options for your federal Army Corps permit. And as you can see in the flow chart on the right, there are a lot of different agencies and entities involved in the process of issuing this federal permit. So like I said, the Army Corps is ultimately the issuer of that federal permit. But before they issue it, they have to notify and consult with tribes in the area, indicated by the gold box on the right. They must also consult with NOAA Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife under the Endangered Species Act. And then if the proposed farm involves dredging or filling, you're going to need a Section 401 water quality certification from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality before the Army Corps can issue that federal permit. So in that way, the 401 certification is linked to the federal permit process. In addition, the activity permitted by the Army Corps, in this case shellfish aquaculture, must be consistent with Oregon's enforceable policies, or in other words, the local and state rules, laws, and regulations. So to ensure this, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD, conducts a federal consistency review. And you can see in the yellow circle on the right that if DLCD determines that the activity is consistent with Oregon's policies, then the ODA plat lease and the Army Corps permit are both approved. And then there's one other federal permit that may be required, and that's the Private Aid to Navigation Permit, or PATON, from the U.S. Coast Guard. So you'll want to contact the Coast Guard to find out if you need that permit. After obtaining your plat lease and your federal and state permits, you'll need commercial shellfish licenses from the Oregon Department of Agriculture if you're selling shellfish for human consumption. So you'll need a grower license, and then there are a variety of other licenses to choose from related to selling or processing product, depending on what activities you're undertaking. And lastly, you'll need a mariculture transport permit from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to transport shellfish between states or within the state if that shellfish is to be placed in state waters. So I know that was, I covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, but that was a bird's eye view of the permitting process for shellfish aquaculture in Oregon, which, like Alex mentioned, is largely oyster aquaculture. In Oregon, we also have land-based mariculture, including cultivation of dulse seaweed and purple urchins in tanks. And there's no documented application pathway for land-based mariculture available yet, but I am going to share some of the permits, approvals, and licenses that you may need for this. So the first one, again, is the federal permit from the Army Corps. And so this is for any construction affecting navigable waterways and submerged lands, which would likely be for intakes and outfalls in the case of land-based mariculture. You'll also want to make sure you're adhering to local regulations and zoning, obtaining any relevant local permits and approvals. You may need a discharge permit from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality for whatever is flowing out of your system. You may also need permits from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife or Oregon Parks and Rec related to broodstock sourcing. And then you also likely need food safety permits or documents or licenses from the Oregon Department of Agriculture. So I know that was a pretty bare bones overview for land-based mariculture, but we are excited to hear that the Oregon Coast Visitors Association has been working on a more comprehensive overview of the regulatory compliance requirements for land-based mariculture, which will provide more clarity on how this process works.
And Oregon does not currently have any in-water seaweed mariculture. And so, as such, the policies and permitting processes for this are very poorly defined. There is not currently a lead agency, and there's uncertainty around which agency's jurisdictions seaweed cultivation would fall under for in-water cultivation. So seaweed occurs over submerged aquatic lands, which would fall under Department of State lands, but they don't generally oversee agricultural production. And there's some conflicting language in DSL policies. So you may lease submerged lands to harvest kelp or seaweed, and simultaneously, Department of State lands does not permit for the removal of kelps and seaweed, but it doesn't have any specific language related to aquaculture or seaweed mariculture. So this leaves us with a little bit of a black box in what the permitting pathway might look like for in-water seaweed mariculture in Oregon. So during the Mariculture Future Forum back in November and through discussions with a variety of agencies, industry researchers, and restoration practitioners, among others, we've identified a variety of challenges related to mariculture policies and permitting in Oregon. And I just kind of have thrown them all up on here. I'm not going to read them all to you. Um, but we have been working with the National Sea Grant Law Center to conduct some legal research to understand the context behind some of these challenges and compare to models in other states. And so I'm really excited that we're going to be able to now transition to a presentation from the National Sea Grant Law Center to talk about some of these.
Yeah, and while y'all pull your slides up, I'll just introduce the folks from the Sea Grant Law Center. So we have Stephanie Otts, who's the director of the National Sea Grant Law Center at the University of Mississippi School of Law. As the director, Stephanie oversees a variety of legal education, research, and outreach activities, including providing legal research services to Sea Grant constituents on ocean and coastal law issues. And then Kathy Janasie is Senior Research Counsel with the National Sea Grant Law Center. And over her time at the Law Center, Kathy has worked on various aquaculture projects, including being the Law Center's lead on seaweed aquaculture. So with that, I will pass it over to Stephanie and Kathy.
Thanks, Susie, and thanks, Alex, so much. Thanks for the invitation to join today. And we're excited to kind of share what we've been doing so far. And so Kathy and I are going to tag team the presentation a bit today. But just For brief introduction, beyond kind of what we do, if you're not familiar, the National Sea Grant Law Center is one of the 34 Sea Grant programs around the country. So like Oregon Sea Grant, but we were established to meet a unique need in the network, which was to conduct non-advocacy legal research, education, and outreach for the entire network. So encourage you to check out our website if that's something that you're more interested in. And I just wanted to briefly touch on one of our services because it's the way that this project is moving forward with Oregon Sea Grant, just to give you context for our approach and where we're coming from. So the National Sea Grant Law Center does have an advisory service. This is a legal research service that is available to Sea Grant programs and some affiliated agencies. But a Sea Grant program can come to the Law Center and submit a question. We work collaboratively with the programs to develop the scope of work. Then the research is conducted either by the Law Center attorneys with assistance for students. And then we draft letters, give presentations like this to answer the question. And I just wanted to highlight that we serve all over the country. Currently, we have 22 aquaculture related requests in our database, and the little bubbles show they've come from all over the country. So this is an area that we frequently work in. And as Alex mentioned, Oregon Sea Grant approached us with these initial research questions related to mariculture barriers in Oregon, and that are kind of in three big buckets related to species limitations, the lease process, and operations. And so the National Sea Grant Law Center started to conduct research to provide additional context and background for these barriers. And I want to share, before we talk about what we found, that our research to date has been what I consider like a paper exercise. We were looking primarily at Oregon statutes and regulations and what they actually said and how they are working together to try to provide information for where the barriers are coming from. We did not talk to any state agency staff. We did not dig into permit applications or policies and things like this. This is really about what is the express legal framework on the books. So the first thing we looked at are these shellfish species limitations. And so Alex and Suzie have already touched on some of this, but the ODA has statutory authority to issue plats for oyster, clam, and mussel cultivation. New plat applications are expressly limited to oysters. But if you had an oyster plat that was in effect before June 1st, 1997, you can apply for a mussel or clam plat. So that's in statute from the legislature. Those statutory provisions are incorporated into ODA regulations at the 603, 802, 0040. So one thing that the Law Center did, we did do some research into the legislative history for the Oregon legislature related to the passage of the language related to mussel and clams and that June 1st, 1997 deadline. We did find a transcript of a legislative hearing that suggests that those restrictions were intentional choices to try to ensure that the industry grew at a sustainable level, or at least that's what the legislatures thought. So they were not oversights in that sense. So there is documentation in the legislative history that these were intentional restrictions. So legislative action would be needed to amend Oregon Revised Statute 622-250 to permit ODA to issue leases for other species. Now, if such legislation were passed, then ODA would have the authority to subsequently amend their regulation to implement that expanded authority. Now, that's a bit separate from seaweed, and so I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to talk about seaweed.
Yeah. So, hello everyone. Nice to see everyone, and thanks for having us today. So with the seaweed species limitations, as everyone has already mentioned, ODA is really limited in what they have under statutory authority, the authority to do. So they currently do not have any regulatory authority over seaweed. And so in order for them to kind of become the lead agency for seaweed, that would require legislative action by the state of Oregon to give them that power. DSL, on the other hand, can issue waterway leases for commercial, industrial, and residential structures or other similar uses of Oregon-owned waterways under Oregon law. And those structures can include aquaculture facilities. But there is a provision in the DSL regulations that specifically says that kelp can't be included in that authorization process. So that language is here on this slide. It defines aquaculture to mean the culture of farming or harvesting of food fish, shellfish, and other plants, exclusive of kelp, which is governed by Division 125 of the Department's administrative rules, which are the special permit provisions. So next slide, Steph. And so the statute, as Alex and Suzie mentioned as well, also authorizes the Department of State lands to lease those lands for the purpose of harvesting kelp or other seaweed after consulting with the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And then the removal of less than 2,000 pounds of kelp per year for personal consumption is allowed without a lease. So that kind of wild harvest is allowed without any kind of authorization. But then by regulation, DSL has also prohibited the commercial removal of kelp. So commercial enterprises for wild harvest of kelp has been prohibited by DSL. Okay. And so then finally, through our research, we've noted that kind of some clarity from Department of State lands would really be helpful to kind of see and pick their brain about kind of how they view all these provisions together. And so that first one is to kind of get clarity on what is meant by their definition of aquaculture and how it specifically references kelp but also references other plants. And so what species does that mean to cover? And we know when we say this that seaweeds aren't technically plants, but it would be kind of worth clarifying with DSL about kind of just seeing what other seaweed species other than kelp could be authorized through a waterway lease. And then secondly, kind of to see how those commercial wild harvest provisions may be interacting with commercial seaweed harvesting. And so do they kind of see that prohibition that they have for commercial wild harvest being prohibited to also apply to commercial seaweed aquaculture with a waterway lease?
Thanks, Kathy. So one thing that also the National Sea Grant Law Center does, we have national scale projects working with state regulators around the country about aquaculture regulation. And so one thing that Oregon Sea Grant was kind of asking us is, well, how does Oregon match up to other states, right? Like, are there things that could be learned from other states? And these are just three big categories of differences that we've identified with respect to the species limitations and also some of the permitting processes that were presented before. And that is other states generally grant broader authority to whatever agency they want to lead aquaculture. So instead of doing it species by species, that has been the case in Oregon, the legislature will just say X agency has authority to issue leases for aquaculture, with aquaculture defined broadly. Other states also have streamlined application processes, but not every state. Some states are as disjointed as Oregon, but there are examples of streamlined processes. And then states may also have a lot more policy guidance to help individuals apply for permits or navigate the process. Um, I wanted to mention Florida because I think Florida is probably the most streamlined organization that we have seen out there for governing aquaculture. So the Florida legislature has granted the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services the authority to be the lead agency in regulating and encouraging the development of aquaculture. Aquaculture is defined broadly to include all aquatic organisms, and in Florida, that includes land-based, in water, all the different kind of systems. And so FDACS is authorized to issue aquaculture certificates. They issue the licenses and permits for aquaculture, which are sometimes were granted to them by the legislature, but they also may have negotiated a memorandum of understanding with another agency to be able to do that, right? So there's some things happening behind the scenes where authority has been delegated to FDACS to do that. They also lease the lands and the water column for the purposes of aquaculture, and they are directed to act as the clearinghouse for aquaculture applications. So their website is very robust. They're the entity you go to, and they coordinate the things behind the scenes. Alaska is another good model for this broad authorization. So the aquatic farm product is defined broadly to include plants or shellfish. Now, noting that in Alaska, finfish is excluded from aquatic farm products. So they do have a narrower definition than Florida because it's just shellfish and plants, but it's still all shellfish and plants. Now, in Alaska, there are two primary agencies. Department of Fish and Game is responsible for aquatic farm operation permits, and Department of Natural Resources are responsible for submerged land leasing. So unlike Florida, there are more agencies involved. But the agencies have worked together through working groups to develop a joint agency aquatic farm lease and operation permit to streamline the application review. So they have application window opens, applications go to DNR, and then DNR forwards the application to all the other agencies that need to review or issue permits, including Department of Fish and Game. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy to dig in a little more about the questions related to modification of leases.
Yeah, so the last kind of topic we wanted to cover that we've been digging into is this modification piece. So the ODA shellfish lease statute does outline a process for new applications, which includes mandatory public notice periods. But the statute is quiet and does not speak to kind of changing those approved shellfish plat leases. And so there's no kind of regulatory language that gives us kind of any direction on what kind of amendment or modification of approved leases would be through the statute and regulatory provisions. On the DSL side, the waterway lease statute is also silent regarding modifications in Oregon, but they do have a process that they've adopted through their regulations. And so those regulations say that a holder release cannot change the authorized use or increase the size of the authorized area without prior written authorization from the department. Applications for changes are processed in the same manner as new lease applications. And so that same process is going to apply. And kind of what we've kind of parsed and looking at the two is that the lease modification process that has been put in regulation by DSL is kind of functionally similar to the steps that ODA would take with respect to requested change to shellfish pat leases. Notably, still kind of going through that full process that could require public notice and comment. And so we just looked briefly again to Alaska to kind of see what their modification process looks like for them. And so depending on kind of the type of the modification, the amendment process can look potentially different. So they do have a process where it would only go to their Department of Fish and Game. And so those would be kind of smaller changes, such as adding or removing the type of species that you're doing. And then both their Department of Fish and Game and the Department of Natural Resources would have to look at kind of changes to gear and equipment as well. Similar to kind of what's in Oregon, kind of some bigger changes in the Alaska process still do require to go out for public notice. And so they're going to follow that similar process of an initial application in Alaska as well. And so those changes are like making the lease footprint bigger, changing the lease location, or having kind of significant changes to gear, equipment, or facilities. And so kind of similar to what we have here in Oregon for those bigger changes. Other things that we wanted to note was that both agencies do have regulations related to the amendment process. So they have been kind of codified in the state. Neither regulation references what happens if your amendment application is denied. So what the ramifications would be in Alaska. But then also to note is that Alaska has put together a really helpful amendment website for growers to kind of walk through the process. And so they kind of explain kind of this process of having to only go to maybe Fish and Game or having to go through multiple agencies. They have a matrix that can help growers kind of work through the process, as well as kind of good links to all kind of the applications and documents they could need. So that was the one thing to note about Alaska is kind of how helpful their website is for their regulated community.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. So I know we went through that fast, and we're really only talking about today, like 3 pieces that we've been looking at for Oregon Sea Grant. But just to kind of sum up here at the end for shellfish, legislative action would be needed to expand the type of shellfish ODA can authorize or other species, and the constraints in the ODA leasing process with respect to modification or amendments mimic constraints in the state lands process, although it does show up in different places in the regulations or the law. But just functionally, what ODA is requiring for leasing amendments is similar to what the Department of State Lands requires for waterway leases. And then with respect to seaweed, again, legislative action would be needed to provide ODA with authority to regulate seaweed aquaculture, and that, we think it would be helpful to get some clarification regarding how DSL is interpreting their regulations with respect to kelp and then seaweed wild harvest. Would be good. And I think with that, we can take clarifying questions, or we can open it up for other comments as well. Stop my share.